Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Saying good morning. My name's Stephen Dorrell. I'm a director of LaingBuisson, and I've been asked to chair this morning's webinar, where we're going to be talking about risk in the social care world. And I'm going to introduce the subject relatively slowly, just to allow people to join the webinar, but people have already, in truth, joined in significant numbers. So I think we've got an hour and a quarter this morning where we're going to focus on this theme of risk in the world of social care. And risk, of course, is a word that has a number of different specific meanings. And our panelists this morning are going to address the question of risk for people operating in the social care world, to address how risk arises and how indeed it can be managed, and sometimes what the consequences of not managing risk effectively can be. Nobody living in the world of social care can be unaware of the risks that gather around social care businesses. Nobody will be unaware of it in any circumstance, but particularly not given the now nearly 2 years, or coming up 2 years, that we've been living with the consequences for our society, but also for social care businesses and the social care sector of the COVID pandemic. So that's the background to this morning's webinar. Let me briefly introduce, I shall introduce them properly as they speak to us, but we're fortunate this morning to have 4 experts in different aspects of risk. Firstly, Mei-Ling, who's a partner of Royds, Withy, who specializes in the management of legal risk. Secondly, Pete Calveley, who's chief executive of Barchester, needs no introduction, I'm sure, to anyone in this audience, but is skilled over many years at managing operational risk. Thirdly, I shall turn to Nathan Hollow, who's head of health and social care at PLMR, who can talk and think about the implications for reputation risk. And fourthly, and finally, I shall turn to Philip Dern, who's the UK healthcare practice leader at Marsh, who can talk to us about how risk can be managed from an insurance perspective. So very warm welcome to all 4 of our panelists. Thank you to Marsh and to Royds, Withy, who are our partners in the presentation of this webinar. Before I turn first to Mei-Ling, I'd just like to show one slide from LaingBuisson, which tells in statistical form a story that is very, very familiar, not just to people in social care, but to actually to the wider community. It's why the government was yesterday, and this is not on today's agenda, talking about social care with a profile that it would previously not have done. So if we look at these 3 lines on the graph, the top graph, these lines look at deaths among residents of care homes in England from the beginning of the pandemic to the end of 2020. The top line, starting from the left, is the total mortality in the community as a whole. People dying with COVID registered as the cause during the period from March to December last year. The bottom line, starting on the left, is the number of those people, the section of that larger number, who were residents of care homes. So it's hardly surprising, given that number of people dying in care homes, that there was a profile around the question of COVID security in the care home sector. The dotted line shows a more stable sense, shows in effect that 40% of people who died with COVID as the registered cause, positive diagnosis for COVID within the previous 28 days, That was the definition. 40% of the people in the top line were residents of care homes, i.e. the people in the bottom line. That's the statistical background to the conversation we're having this morning. But perhaps I can turn first, if I may, to Mei-Ling. She's head of healthcare at Royds Withy King. She specializes in the sector and has long experience of advising and supporting clients living with these issues from a legal point of view. So Mei-Ling Huang, you are extremely welcome. We look forward to what you have to say.
Thank you very much. That's quite a sobering set of statistics, but quite important. So thank you for sharing those, first of all, quite interesting. Thanks everybody for joining us. I'm a social care lawyer. I provide troubleshooting and crisis management advice to care services. I'm going to talk today about CQC, risk, and the shifting regulatory landscape. And I just want to give a really brief overview of where we were before the pandemic, where we are now with CQC, and where we might be going, which is a little bit unclear, but I'm going to give you hopefully a bit of a steer. So I want you, first of all, to roll your minds back to January of 2020. Before the pandemic, CQC were already taking quite a strict approach. And I remember distinctly around that time, I saw some surprisingly sudden and precipitous drops in ratings, followed by heavy compliance action. We then locked down in March, and CQC couldn't cross the threshold, and everything came to pretty much a juddering halt. And then they started to work their way into a new way of working. Fast forwarding to today, the current picture is that CQC have not returned to what was business as usual. In other words, they're not inspecting on a schedule. Instead, they're monitoring risk, our key word for today, and there are triggers for an inspection. So you might have a safeguarding incident, you might have a complaint, you might have a whistleblowing. Basically, the regulator is now responding to risk. And if they perceive there to be an issue, they will ask you for information, and they may then cross the threshold and inspect. So the ratings are indicative of this. I've been watching the ratings awarded each month since about June, and they reflect this shift to the risk-based approach. And this is because CQC are really only inspecting, I think, when they find calls for concerns. So taking the numbers from August, during that month, CQC published inspection reports for 321 residential care homes, and I'm only talking about residential care homes. 42% of those care homes were given an overall good or outstanding rating, and a whopping 57% were given a rating that requires improvement or inadequate. This is unheard of since they've started doing ratings way back in 2014. And it shows the massive shift that's going on in terms of the approach. And it feels, when it hits you, it feels quite bleak. So when the inspectors call, they don't seem to be interested in a particularly holistic view of a service. Instead, they're looking to root out risk. So what happens if you get an inadequate inspection? Well, right now, CQC are serving lots of letters of intent, and these ask you to provide information and usually in an action plan, and they give you about 24 hours to reply. And if they're not satisfied with your response, they will start compliance action. So that's the current picture. Shifting to the view going forward, what's going to happen next with regulation and compliance? Well, I think the landscape will continue to change. And exactly how is it difficult to say right now, but we're moving away from the more holistic, intuitive mum test type of approach for something that appears to aspire to be more technologically driven and possibly more mathematical, statistical. So the information provided so far by CQC has been pretty general, but I think tomorrow they're rolling out some sector engagement with trade associations. So we'll probably start to get a clearer picture. And there's also some updated information on their website. So I'm speaking somewhat speculatively, but I think we're going to see some significant changes. I think from what I can glean, they appear to be heading towards slimming down the CLOEs, the prompts, the ratings characteristics, and a lot of you will be familiar with the big sort of table of information that's available on their website with all those things in there. They're going to try to implement a new, more numerically based model. So they seem to be indicating that they will score you on various criteria and then add up the scores to determine a rating. And it appears that the evidence base will now consist of a combination of feedback from people, so staff, people using services, relatives, etc., along with information from other sources like local authorities, Health Watch, and they will also probably ask the provider and manager for information, and if they find cause for concern, they may cross the threshold and inspect. So it's still unclear how all these new standards and evidence gathering methodologies will stack up, but it does appear to me that they're going to try to carry out more frequent assessments of a service. In other words, keep tabs on things on a more rolling basis. And that's already starting to be the current direction of travel with the calls that they've been doing to managers starting in July. And I believe that the goal is to build up a picture of a service over time rather than this sort of one snapshot in time every year, 2 years, 3 years. In my mind, the biggest question of all is whether providers will get a sufficient right of response to the evidence base for CQC's findings. There has been no mention in anything that I've read so far about a factual accuracy process. And I am concerned that if facts are found with no right of reply, then ratings and compliance action will be based on only partially accurate evidence. So that is, to me, the most important thing. I've looked through a couple of surveys that CQC have posted on their website about their new approach and asking you for your opinion on that. And I think the trouble with the surveys is that they ask you to comment on parts of the system. We really want to know how the whole system will work, and we want to know whether providers will get a fair shake. So I would encourage you to engage with CQC as much as possible on this. If you can, speak to them through your care associations, speak to your inspection managers. If you have concerns about what they are proposing, make them known. CQC wants to know what you think, so this is your chance to tell them while the model is still being formed, not after they've laid it on you. And you may have to fight for that right of reply. So don't let that go unsaid if it is a concern to you. Thank you very much, Stephen. That's all for me.
Thank you very much, Mei-Ling. That's a great introduction, focuses on one of the, I'm going to turn my camera on, apologies. It focuses on one of the aspects of risk from an operator's point of view. And clearly, as we move beyond the stages of the, I'm trying to avoid saying move beyond the pandemic, because I think we're some way from that yet. But as we move into the next phase, it's what you've highlighted is evolving practice on the part of the CQC. And it's important, I think, that the sector as a whole, first of all, understands what is going on within the CQC and this concept of shifting towards monitoring risk as an essential part of the regulatory process, and then has a clear voice about whether the processes that are being evolved by the CQC do indeed measure risk, or are we simply measuring a different form of box, which for us to tick, which is a completely different concept. And that's a process that I think is still relatively new. And I think what you've done is to highlight it, and no doubt people will want to raise questions on it in the Q&A session. I should have said at the beginning that please, if you do wish to raise a point on any of these presentations with the panelists, please put it in the Q&A function, and I will seek to draw on that in the Q&A session following the presentations. But thanks very much to Mei-Ling. That gets us off to a good start and gives, if Pete, unusually for him, hadn't decided what he was going to say before he came, it gives him plenty to go at, just responding to what Mei-Ling has said about the evolving practice of the CQC. But Pete, you're very well Chief Executive of Barchester, as everyone knows, and be keen to hear how you believe the sector is addressing the risk questions that we face as the pandemic unfolds.
Sure. Morning, everyone. As Stephen said, I'm Chief Exec of Barchester Healthcare. Formerly, I was a GP and then a medical director of a health authority with responsibility for commissioning, service redesign and professional performance. We run, as Barchester, we're the second largest provider in the UK. We have 250 care homes and around 15,000 beds. In terms of our business strategy, which obviously is intimately linked to regulation or response to regulation, it has been for the last 7 years to grow like-for-like business by improved performance, to have a new build program where we're now opening 10 new care homes a year, and to do selective mergers and acquisitions. Just before the pandemic, we acquired 35 homes in 2 transactions. Very much echoing Mei-Ling's comments, we've noticed this inspection on risk basis, which is only going to the homes where there have been concerns raised. And my concern with that is that actually homes that have been previously requires improvement haven't been inspected for 2 years and some up to 3 years. And we know internally with our audits that they're now good or outstanding, and they've no opportunity to demonstrate that and improve their local reputation because CQC have no concerns about them, so they aren't inspecting. And I think that is a distortion of the representation of our care homes and the care home sector to the public, because in the end, they're only producing 50% of their inspections are good, and the rest requires improvement or outstanding. And the homes, many of our homes don't have an opportunity to demonstrate that they're now good or outstanding. So that's my concern, Stephen. I'll probably leave it at that.
Well, thanks very much, Pete. And the theme you raise of ensuring that I don't think anybody, I'm sure you wouldn't wish to inhibit the capacity of the regulator to intervene quickly if the care being provided didn't meet basic standards required for in the interests of the resident. But equally, regulation has to be a balance between that risk management in the interests of the resident and ensuring that people can operate businesses and when they do invest in improved service, that's recognized. And that's a very real challenge. Is that's the subject that's been under discussion between the sector and the CQC for some time. Do you sense that there's been a change in the way the CQC has reacted to that argument?
I do, actually. And in our experience, I think previously the CQC's sort of mantra was they go into a home looking for good. At the moment, I'm not sure that's the case. They are not looking for good. They're looking to cover their risk in case, and they're not searching for good. They are searching for concerns. And I don't think the balance currently on the inspection regime is the right balance. And so many of the inspections we've had in the last few months, we've disagreed with. Normally we just hold our hands up if there's an issue with a particular home, and we don't have any issue, and we don't usually put a factual accuracy check in. But there's been quite a lot of homes that we've been rated requires improvement rather than good, where actually we fundamentally disagree with the balance of the report, and we find that the issues that have been led to requires improvement are not actually significant issues, and yet there's been intransigence from the CQC. So they don't seem to be looking for good anymore. They don't seem to have the right balance. They're just covering their own risk, really.
Hmm. Well, it's a hugely important point you're making. It's actually a slightly different point, isn't it? That that's the point that Mei-Ling was making, that when the CQC issue a conclusion, there should be, in the interests of maintaining a proper balance, the right to check for factual accuracy. So it's A, do you agree with the rating in the first place? And B, if you do, and the rating requires improvement or inadequate, does the opportunity exist to do the improvement that the CQC says is required, and then have the CQC recognize that it's happened? So it's one, factual accuracy, and two, quick response to deliver improvement. Both are important.
Absolutely, that's absolutely correct. But there has been some intransigence. Previously, there's been a balanced view when we've come back with information that perhaps wasn't available on the day, or put things right. There has been we haven't had, I don't believe, one adjustment despite us producing evidence. So I do think there's a very different approach at the moment. And the problem is, if you've been given requires improvement now, but then you fix it, and there's no concerns, then under the current regime, they will not visit again. It will just remain requires improvement because they won't have any concerns about it, which means we're not unable to showcase improvement. in our good homes that have been rated good but haven't been inspected for a long time, we can't showcase current position or potentially their move to outstanding because they're of no concern, so CQC don't have them as a priority. So I do think part of that is a change in approach. Part of that is probably a lack of capacity for inspections, which I think current CQC are currently struggling with. So the combination of the two means that many of our homes that were requires improvement, which was not that many, but that were, can't showcase, and the staff can't be, recognised for the improvements they've made because they're of no interest to CQC at the moment.
Do you think there's another? I'm going to move on in a second, but there's another question here as well, where you've had a rating that it may have been good or even outstanding, but it's some time ago, and therefore they haven't come back to you because there isn't the risk rating looks low. Somebody just looking at that rating maybe 3, 4, 5 years ago would say, actually, that's not really relevant. There comes a point when a rating isn't credible because it's too old.
Absolutely, and that's definitely the case, Stephen. Many of our homes haven't been inspected for more than 2 years, and people will look at the website and say, actually, that's not relevant. There's nothing recent on there, and I think that is a real problem for us. And it's really an impact on the staff and the management of the home, who actually know they're running a great service, but they're not being recognised as such.
Okay. Some serious issues there that I'm sure people will wish to pick up in the Q&A and also in the chat. I think people, Jade encourages us to use the Q&A, but people are using the chat as well. So please feel free to do both. I'm going to move now to Nathan Hollow, who's the head of health at PLMR, that's a public affairs consultancy. Nathan, I think some of the issues that have been discussed both by Mei-Ling and by Pete Calveley raise challenges for you in managing the reputation of the social care sector. So there's the specific challenges that have been raised, but also, of course, the very general challenge of the background of the last 2 years and the statistics that I mentioned at the beginning, which don't make your, they must make it possible for people to understand how you can add value to their business.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, everyone. So yeah, I'm Nathan, and PLMR is a full-service communications agency, but a lot of what I do is corporate comms and press work, particularly around reputational challenges. I had 5 quick talking points, which I'll rattle through, but I'll do in reverse order based on what Stephen just talked about. So I think the press appetite for a negative story about a care service is as high as it ever has been, but their knowledge base is quite low. A trend that we've been seeing is that when there has been a regulator action in recent months, that it's now linked, the press story links that to how many COVID deaths occurred in a service, which is often unfair and arguably unrelated to a report that came out probably a year after an outbreak occurred. But nevertheless, that is something that we're seeing quite a lot. And so I think that has a bit of a long tail impact when we consider the data that is out and available. And associated with that, I would say that local journalists in particular, but even some national journalists, have a very limited understanding of the social care sector, how it works, how it's regulated. And that creates its own challenge in trying to correct misunderstandings and information that's misconstrued as well. During the pandemic, I think a lot of operators have been communicating much more regularly with their families and perhaps with their stakeholders as well, to explain what's going on at home level, and particularly families, to obviously demonstrate that residents are being kept safe, being kept entertained. I think it's very difficult to row back from that as we move out of the height of the pandemic and kind of move into a phase of living with COVID and trying to get back to normal. I think it's very difficult to move away from a regular communications program. That will be the expectation of families, and I think operators need to recognise that. You know, my inbox is filled with emails from my favourite restaurants, clothing stores, etc. once a week telling me something. So why should my grand's care home not email me once a week to tell me what they've been up to, how my gran is, what her life's been like. So I think it's important for operators to remember to maintain regular communications with those, particularly with families, because if you step back from that, that might create a challenge. Families generate headlines, which would be my third point. More often than not, I get a phone call from an operator who needs some help responding to a press query. If that query is generated by a family member complaining to the local newspaper, more often than not, there were multiple opportunities to have prevented that family reaching that point of exasperation. So, as we move forward, and Mei-Ling touched on the fact that that family testimony and will play a role in how the CQC considers risk and grades services moving forward. Engaging with families and tackling issues head on quickly and appropriately, I think, will be more important than it's ever been. Making sure that everybody knows how to escalate concerns. If a family has got a concern, that it's escalated appropriately and it's dealt with by someone at the right level, and it's not seen as somebody moaning unnecessarily, but it's responded to accordingly. Would be really important. Simplicity is my fourth point. Something that I was taught when I joined PLMR was to write everything for the reading age of a 12-year-old, I think, which would be the average. I think there's often a lot of jargon in the social care sector that people at home won't understand. So again, a lot of the letters I receive about my grand's care home, I understand because I work in the sector, but my sister does not. And so things like multidisciplinary meetings, what does an action plan actually mean to anybody at home if you don't provide the specific detail on what you're doing? What is infection prevention and control? Again, to your average person sat at home, I think it's worth being really clear on what those things mean, helping people understand what you're doing. And then my final point would be around clear internal communication. So if the regulatory environment is changing, and again, staff are going to play a role in feeding back to the CQC as part of that, I think it's really important to have clear touch points of staff so that they understand the changes that are happening to the regulatory regime, and that they are kind of brought on the journey with you to understand what they need to do in terms of the service that's provided, but also how they can work with each other and work with the manager to make sure that the service is the best it can be, and feel fully engaged and brought into the process of delivering a quality care service. So those would be my kind of 5, I guess, communications objectives that people can work on moving forward.
Nathan, thank you very much. I react particularly strongly and favourably to your point about, I would put it slightly differently, expressing the language in plain English, in jargon-free English. I like to think my reading age is a little beyond 12, but I sometimes find the stuff that comes out of professional bodies completely impenetrable. And it's just putting it in plain English, using the same language that we use in our daily lives, rather than resorting to a kind of private code that means we're exchanging messages with each other in language which might just as well be in Swahili, frankly, for its capacity to communicate with the people around us.
Yeah, I think for me, it's the email you would send to your commissioner or to your CQC contact. You can use that language, but you can tell the same story, but in a much more simplistic way when you're sending the update to your families or talking to local councillors, because actually I think people should really engage with their local elected officials. They play an important part in your reputation in the local community, can often get involved if something goes wrong. So engaging them positively before something goes wrong is also worth doing, and just keeping them updated on, your every care home, I believe, is an important community asset, community resource. And so you should talk to those elected officials as well.
It's quite an important part of your job, I think, is to understand that if you have a story to tell and you take the initiative, you at least frame the story. If you wait for other people to frame the story, you're only ever reacting to their questions It's the way I quite often put it is that if you assume the worst of people, they seldom disappoint.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. My mantra actually is never to issue a no comment response, because I think any comment you issue gives you a chance to shape the story, whether you've been bounced with a negative story from a local or national paper. Any comment you issue gives you a chance to shape the outcome of that story. But more importantly, if you've actually got a really positive story to tell, you should be engaging with your local press and building those relationships and getting that story out there. And if you can't do it with your local press, you should do it on social media, which is hugely powerful in many communities, particularly Facebook.
A whole other subject. Perhaps we shouldn't go down that particular rabbit hole. Thank you very much, Nathan. So our fourth panelist is Philip Dearn, who's the UK healthcare practice leader at Marsh, it's a worldwide insurance business. And Philip, you're going to talk to us about how your sector can help us manage these risks that people are talking about.
Morning, everybody. Yeah, thanks for that. Yes, obviously 2020 was a somewhat unprecedented year for the insurance world. I think the last time insurance conditions even remotely got back to anything like 2020 was probably post 9/11. And the pandemic sort of threw a lot of things up in the air into a market that was already starting to turn, having been very soft in the insurance market. And there were also a lot of things that were pretty much unprecedented in terms of the nationwide lockdowns of hospitality and retail, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm not going to go through all of the slides that I put up, but just for a bit of context, the costs of the insurance industry so far, well, as at the 30th of June this year, arising from COVID-19, this is globally, but bearing in mind most of the insurers that play in the UK market, has been to date around about $37 billion. None of that was expected. And clearly the insurance industry had a knee-jerk reaction to the pandemic in the early stages when there was the transfer of people from the NHS, challenges around PPE. We had designated settings earlier this year, and all of the media stuff that was coming out into the public domain. So that's the sort of look backwards. Looking forwards, we're going to be reviewing very carefully what the CQC are planning to do and the changes that they're going to make in terms of their focus and how we can support our clients. We've got around about 13,000 healthcare clients in the UK. We're a $1.5 billion turnover business in the UK, and we support over 1,250 care sector clients of all different shapes and sizes, ranging from fairly small to some of the largest providers in the UK. And we support them on a whole range of different areas, right through the risk insurance needs, whether that's from placing their insurance programs, their general insurance programs, their directors and officers fleet.
Philip, I'm sorry to talk across you. You are breaking up a bit. I wonder if you turn your camera off, we might hear you better.
Is that a little bit better?
It's so, yeah, keep going. But
I'll keep it off. Sorry, apologies if I've got unstable internet. Okay, so yeah, so we're supporting all of those clients right across their risk and insurance needs. What's the future look like? I think insurers are undoubtedly a lot more interested in operators' CQC performance. Other than their underwriting information and claims data, it's about the only external type of validation that they can get. And we've just heard from Pete and from Mei-Ling around the inconsistencies around, when homes have been inspected, stuff being out of date, need for challenge. And I think there's an important role for the insurance and risk advisor to support the care provider in actually getting that story across to insurers and demonstrating that to insurers. So if there are homes that maybe are requiring improvement in terms of their CQC report, but those measures have been addressed, but just not updated by CQC. That's an important area where we can advise, we can support on crisis management and continuity planning, and we can support on other areas in terms of operational risk. Taking a look forwards for the insurance markets, last year was very, very tough. This year hasn't been easy, but there are signs that it's leveling off. It started to level off in the second part of this year. I think that there's room for cautious optimism. I think there'll be inconsistencies with insurance markets. There will be some increased capacity. We're seeing 1 or 2 new players come into the market, which is good. That's going to stimulate competition and will provide more capacity. I think some of the schemes that traditionally serve the smaller providers still may have some headwinds if those schemes have been historically unprofitable for insurers. And I think insurers are still going to be looking quite hard at areas of risk, that particularly around concerns around staffing levels and vaccination take-up. And again, the more good information we can supply to the insurance market around what an operator is doing in terms of managing those risks, the better. So I think there's some signs for cautious optimism going forwards, and we're supporting all of our clients through that journey.
Philip, thank you very much for note of optimism. Optimism from an insurance leader is not always what you get. So thank you for that. And there's clearly, there's, to put it mildly, a lot of political interest, a lot of public interest in the sector. And there's some very real issues come out of the presentations this morning that I now want to dwell on. And the 3 letters that have come up repeatedly, unsurprisingly probably, are CQC. And I would just like to focus in on some of the points that have been made, in particular by Mei-Ling and by Calveley, about changing practice by the CQC. And I guess my first question actually is to Mei-Ling and possibly to Nathan as well. What kind of CQC compliance action we're actually seeing now? Is it different? Are they?
Yeah.
We've talked about the perception of risk and the way they're managing, but what if you look at the sanctions they're applying? What's been your experience there?
I think what I'm seeing is faster action and more sort of repeated action. So what I'm seeing is if you get a rating of inadequate, and 54 residential care homes, I think it was 51 in August, were given an overall inadequate rating, then what I would expect just from the trends that I've been seeing is, first of all, a letter of intent, an LOI, which gives you 24 hours in which to provide quite a lot of information, usually documents and potentially an action plan. If CQC aren't happy with your response to that, they will follow up with compliance action. And the letter says, we are considering taking compliance action. And the next step often is an urgent notice of decision to impose a condition on registration. And that is often an embargo, or it could be a requirement that you provide monthly audit reports to CQC so they can kind of keep tabs on what you're doing managerially. And then if the home or the service has had past sort of dips in ratings and past breaches of regulations, the next step, and this usually follows on quite quickly, is a notice of proposal to cancel registration. And then that, of course, needs to be dealt with. But what's different than before, I think, is the rapidity with which these things are served in succession. And the other thing that I'm seeing is if you have a breach of Regulation 18, making notifications of incidents, they are doing quite a few issuing of fixed penalty notices, and those for £1,250. And those have to be dealt with as well. So that's the kind of thing that I'm seeing quite a lot of right now. And it's faster than it was before, and it's heavier than it was before.
And I'm going to bring Pete in when Nathan's had to say, but in those when they come after a care operator in that way, on the basis of the fact that there's been an inadequate or maybe a requires improvement rating, there's two questions I was discussing with Pete. First of all, the factual accuracy of their initial conclusion, and secondly, whether they're willing to engage in a discussion that changes, that recognizes that the service has been improved, because it's implicit in the phrase requires improvement that somebody should show an interest as to whether the improvement has taken place. Is that so? Question to Mei-Ling before Nathan: are you able to get a discussion with the CQC about either factual accuracy or the fact of improvement, or do you agree with Pete that that's a dialogue they're not willing to enter?
Well, I think it's worth a try to engage in the factual accuracy discussion, and I think that the response generally tends to depend, the responsiveness to that overture to CQC generally depends on where you are with the ratings, and also what they view the risks as being. So if you've got an inquest going on, or if you've got a serious safeguarding or allegations made of abuse that are quite serious, then they will be, and if you've got a proposed inadequate rating, then they will be less receptive to that discussion. If the problems that they found are more minor, and you've got a rating of requires improvement in the draft inspection report, then you have a better chance, I would say, at getting it changed. So it depends. It depends. And I think that they are very conscious of the risks, and that weighs up in their consideration. I mean, this is what I'm surmising from observing, and they may say differently, and I'd be interested to hear what they have to say about it actually, but that's my observation.
It seems to me it's a discussion for another day, is to bring the CQC into the room and have the discussion face to face with them rather than talking about them in behind their backs, as it were.
Yeah.
Nathan next, and then Pete, please, and then Philip. How does an insurer deal with this? But Nathan first.
And a very, very quick point for me. Yes, I've seen more of that type of action from the CQC, but also from councils. And I think commissioners are taking a stricter approach in their own monitoring reviews. Maybe a question back to the panel, but something I was curious about was whether the capacity in the market as a result of the decline in occupancy caused by COVID means that commissioners actually have a bit more flexibility to move their funded residents around, and therefore are more willing to take a stricter approach, because I've seen people going straight to looking to remove people from services they're currently funding, which is not one I've had to deal with too often in the past, but seems more common at the moment.
So Pete, how are you responding?
So on the couple of separate points, we have actually had one. We have no inadequate homes for over a year. Then we've recently had one rated inadequate in recent inspections. And as Mei-Ling said, they served a notice of proposal for reporting requirements, which we have to provide monthly data on or weekly data on various things. Why this requires enforcement in this way, when we're very happy to provide this information voluntarily through dialogue, I honestly don't see the purpose of it or why it's in the public interest to put a notice of proposal on to do something that we're very happy to do voluntarily. So that's the situation in that one home. In terms of Nathan's point, we've not experienced anything as he described, but I'm not sure whether obviously Nathan's got experience where it has happened. It's not something we've actually experienced ourselves, so I couldn't really comment.
Okay. And Philip, are you seeing, how much of this are you seeing coming up as in the management of insurance risk or risk management, which is your specialism?
Yeah, and insurers have taken a lot more focus on CQC reports over the last 12 to 18 months. And I think our job is to really, where there are homes that require improvement, or there are any areas of concern. It's very much going to depend on exactly what those are, whether they're somewhat cosmetic or peripheral, or whether they're deep rooted. So if it's relating to, you know, a lack of a home manager, or staff level concerns, or safeguarding, or infection control, then that means that the provider is going to have to be proactive in remedying those to keep insurers confident that they're managing their risk appropriately. I think sometimes that some of the things that we see are fairly common, and that's where we can play a part in supporting the provider in getting the insurer to see the wood for the trees.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, can I move the conversation on? I don't want it to be a conversation exclusively about the CQC. One of the big risk factors, it seems to me, in the social care sector at the moment, it concerns staff morale, staff well-being, staff recruitment and retention, staff reward. And I wonder, Peter, I'm going to come to you first on this, the extent to which you think there is an issue, not just among the wider public of the perception of the sector and how its services have developed, but also among people thinking of coming into social care, and how the sector needs to address that.
So definitely, that's a very good point, Stephen. During the pandemic, I think our inquiries and interest by the public in placing their relatives into the sector dropped dramatically. So, for example, we would normally have 900 inquiries a week across our services. At the height of the pandemic, last April, it dropped to about 250. But since then, and since the vaccination programme and staff vaccination, we're now back to pre-pandemic inquiry levels, and occupancy, which had dropped to around from about 90% to around 81%, is now back at nearly 86%. And has more than half recovered. So I think there is confidence in the public, in the care home sector again. The confidence was clearly knocked with all the bad press and stories that were going around last year, but clearly confidence has returned. In terms of staff morale, I think staff are tired. They're, you know, to some extent, there's a degree of burnout, or there was. Certainly I've seen significant improvement in that, again, over the last few months, where we're coming out and looking forward rather than focusing totally on COVID. And so it is improving, but it is very difficult. And now we're running into a stage where when we did if you did mandatory vaccination policy, which were introduced in May of this year, before the government's legislation, we had no issue. We lost about 1% of staff through either resigning or dismissal through refusing to have vaccination. And we recruited that 1% with no problem in May and June. Now, actually, across the whole sector, recruitment is more of an issue. And it's not due to that policy, I'm sure. It's due to the fact that hospitality's opened up, retail, everyone's looking for staff. And staff of any sort are in demand, chefs, carers, nurses. And I think now it's a difficult time for recruitment in the sector, made, I have to say, particularly worse by the government deciding to mandate vaccination in care homes, but not in the NHS as yet. So a lot of our nurses have simply left the care sector and gone to the NHS, and a lot of our carers who refuse to have vaccination have gone to the NHS. And I think that's just outrageous. And I think it's, I'm sure, being cynical, it's not a recruitment drive by the NHS to do that, by the government to get more people for the NHS. But the side effect of not being firm and not being decisive in doing the logical thing of making NHS staff mandatory vaccinated has been a drain on staff from the care sector to the NHS, which has made things worse, obviously.
That story of the NHS competing for staff that are essentially making a choice between social care and healthcare, or social care and the NHS, that's obviously a long established story, and it isn't just about compulsory vaccination, though I strongly agree with the point you're making. Is that question of the competitiveness of the sector vis-a-vis the NHS, has that been changed over the last couple of years, or over the last 12 months is the only period that matters, basically, isn't it? Do you feel that you've gone backwards, forwards, or stayed roughly the same in terms of competitiveness against the NHS?
I think there's always been an equilibrium between the NHS and the care sector, but for competition for nurses and carers, and so that always has been the case, and it was pretty stable dynamic and a pretty stable equilibrium. And I do think the last few months there has been an opportunity in some, I'm aware some care services, 30 or 40% of staff are declining vaccination, and when it becomes mandatory, which is imminent, people will leave, and people are leaving. So I think that is a new dynamic, and certainly has changed the equilibrium.
I understand there's been an announcement this morning. Somebody has mentioned in the chat that there's been whether it's a formal announcement or the government clearly is inching towards making it mandatory, and they've got all the usual problems that with which I'm familiar about political pressures, but the imposing a legal obligation on one part of the health and care sector and not on another part of the same sector seems to me, at a time when it is official government policy to regard health and care as a single sector, to be nonsensical. But it's a point that is very well made. Philip Dean has indicated that he'd like to come in on this subject.
Yeah, we've been doing a lot of work on both sides of the Atlantic on supporting clients on workforce strategies. I think the planning and being proactive in this situation, as Pete mentioned, hospitality's opened up, retail's opened up. There's lots of competition. We've seen horrific scenarios in logistics, which everybody's aware of from the media, which is feeding into supply chain. And we've been supporting many leading healthcare providers in terms of their workforce strategies to enhance recruitment and retention, how they can be smarter about their benefits, how they can support their staffing services that we provide there in terms of mental health support and health and well-being, and also some unique sort of services in terms of employee engagement models that can for a healthcare provider in terms of improving that engagement between them and their employees. We launched that with a major hospital group last year, and the average number of times that the employees go onto that system, it's monitored, is 11 times a week, which is pretty phenomenal, really. And it really helps to drive that improved employee engagement between the healthcare provider and their workforce.
Okay, thank you. Mei-Ling, can I come to you on this question as well? Is this an issue that you come across from in your legal advice to firms, that thinking about the employment terms and the employment, the fact that that people often say the health service employs 1.5 million people. What they forget is the health and care sector as a whole employs 3 million people, of whom half are in social care. And as Pete says, the interface between the two is very critical to the quality of service in both sectors, in truth.
Yeah, employment's not my area, but we do have a very good social care employment team, and they've been doing an enormous amount of work over the past year about staffing issues and recruitment issues, vaccination. We did a webinar recently, which was very well attended, on vaccination, which is still available online if anybody wants to watch that. I think there is a lot of flow. There's a lot of concern right now about losing people to the NHS, a huge amount of concern, and it's good news that the government has finally started consulting about vaccination for the NHS workers as well. My biggest concern, I think, my bigger concern right now about staffing is just the staffing levels generally and the pressure that managers are coming under. Because as somebody rightly pointed out in the chat, I think managers are having to cover for the fact that there aren't enough staff on duty. And then they are also being further stretched in terms of everything else, infection control, record keeping, all the other stuff. They've had to really, really up their game. And, you know, as Nathan was pointing out, the communications with families as well, there's been an increase in that. So the pressure is rising all around all the time on the managers, and we're losing managers. And if you haven't got a manager, then the whole show kind of falls apart, doesn't it? Because they're the ones who are spinning all the plates and keeping the place going. I'd say that's my biggest concern. But I would say that of our clients, probably staffing is the #1 concern, and we are seeing people lost to the NHS, and particularly nurses, and we are having homes deregister from their nursing, or maybe not deregister from nursing, but stopping providing nursing care and transferring over to being simply residential because they can't get the nurses to do it.
It's Peter, I'm going to sort of bring together 3 elements of the risk for a major social care operator. And I'm just interested to hear how you react to it, to be honest, because it's a phrase that's used too often, is the perfect storm. But you've got you've got 3 key, I'm sure you would add to the list. You've got 3 key elements. You've got the changed behavior of the CQC that you described. We've got pressures on staffing that we just touched on briefly, which are covered. And we've got the government claiming that it's resolved the financing issues of social care, while what it's actually done is to put money into the health service and promise to pay more to social care later. I wonder how you feel about the sector, your capacity. I know you have a lot of self-pay, but the taxpayer-supported part of the sector, how you perceive it the morning after the government says that, or the claim would be presumably that it's fixed social care once and for all, quote unquote.
Really, utter nonsense, Stephen. It's just a shambles. The whole announcement that they were fixing social care, and in doing so, all they're doing is putting the vast majority of the money in the NHS, is just the opposite of fixing social care. And I just think it has been a huge missed opportunity, and it has clearly been driven by NHS demands, not social care. And putting less than £1 billion a year into social care, which is just a few percent, 5% of the current spend in social care, is just absolutely nothing in terms of fixing the problem. And then to combine it with some statement that there's going to be mandatory no difference between self-pay and publicly funded fees, without giving any detail on that, is again a huge shock to the system. Because what does that mean? Whenever money's gone to social care in the past, even though this is a relatively small amount, it goes to local authorities, and the history of what happens then is that the local authorities, in a very postcode lottery way, decide how much they'll pass on, and have no obligation to do so. So it's an absolute shambles, I have to say. And I think staffing, as Mei-Ling said, staffing is the biggest issue at the moment, because all the competition from the different sectors for staff, combined with the fact that the care staff and nurses are pretty exhausted after 18 months of COVID, and actually going to a supermarket might be something that seems much more, or into hospitality might be something that appeals more and gives them a break. I think staffing has reached such an extent. And I echo the fact that some of our managers are having to work shifts on the floor because we can't recruit, or there aren't enough staff for the moment because they're on holiday or whatever. It's come to the stage for the first time ever where if we go to agencies for staff, which obviously is a reluctant thing to do, but if we have to make sure we have safe staffing, agencies often don't have staff themselves. And that's the first time ever that repeatedly across the country, agencies simply don't have staff to fill shifts.
And that circles straight back to the CQC monitoring safe service and so forth. How you maintain a service when those kind of pressures, when you're under those kind of operational pressures.
Absolutely. And there doesn't seem to be any flexibility in the CQC's approach. It seems to be very prescriptive. Clearly, we are not understaffing, but it's an absolute huge amount of work in lots of homes where we're moving staff from home to home. We're asking staff to take on extra shifts. Sometimes the deputies or the managers are working shifts, and it doesn't seem to be you know, a light at the end of the tunnel for the next few months at least.
Okay, I mean, I guess before we talk ourselves into terminal gloom, the practical question is what steps can be taken to relieve the pressure. You can't solve the problem overnight. It's deep-seated, it's huge. I'm going to go round the whole panel, actually. We know, we started off talking about risk. We can identify where the risk issues are. They're reasonably familiar. Risk, the first thing you have to do is to identify the sort of levels of risk, and then identify actions that can be taken to address that risk from an operational point of view. And for anybody running a residential care or indeed a home care business in these circumstances there must be areas that are where the thought process goes, why on earth do they have to make my life that bit more difficult in that way against this set of circumstances? So what are the 2 or 3 things? One would be enough. Pete, how would you respond to that? Then I'll go to Mei-Ling, and then to Nathan, and then to Paul.
I mean, I think this is where dialogue between commissioners, regulators, and providers needs to be, you know, balanced and at a mature and strategic level. And I do think this is a problem facing the whole sector. It needs to be solved by, you know, an understanding between those 3 different elements of the sector that actually, you know, gives some consideration to the issues everyone's facing. And I do think we do need that mature dialogue sometimes in localities where there's particular issues, but also more broadly when it's quite clear to everyone the issue about staffing, the issue about funding, and the issue about vaccinations, etc. And while it's quite clear to everyone, there needs to be a strategic level of dialogue to say, okay, what flexibility do you need to produce evidence of what effort you've made to get staffing? Because the worst thing that could happen, first of all, clearly we don't want poor care due to understaffing, but where there's a short-term issue or even a short to medium-term issue in one particular service or locality, the worst thing that could happen is that residents are moved out to somewhere else who's got the same problems, when actually the best thing to do is to say, okay, what efforts you've made, what more can we do? And at the height of the pandemic, for example, some forward-thinking local authorities offered their own staff to support the homes, and that was fantastic. Some didn't, obviously, but I do think there needs to be a cross-sector understanding and relationship that works together to make sure the problems are ameliorated as best as can be in any one service or across multiple services, and that simply doesn't happen at the moment.
The habit, we said, didn't we, repeatedly at the height of the pandemic, that we're learning new habits of addressing common problems in a common way, and this needs to be bottled and kept and make certain that we don't revert to old habits. I think what you're saying is that we haven't succeeded in doing that. No,
but I have to say, some local authorities and NHS organisations were very supportive during the pandemic, but again, people are reverting back to type, and I'm sure they've got their issues about staffing and recruitment just in the same way. But nevertheless, that's not a reason why you shouldn't put your heads together and come up with a common solution for each locality. No, indeed. Well, in theory, at least that's what's supposed to be happening. We'll see. Mei-Ling. Stephen, I have to say. No, I was quite careful in my choice of words. I was giving the government, I was making certain that the point was made that it is, at least in theory, the policy. Mei-Ling.
I agree with everything Pete has said, and I think that in addition to having that conversation with local authorities and with government, the NHS needs to be part of that conversation as well, because what will inevitably happen is we will lose capacity in the system. There will be more delayed transfers of care out of hospital, and providers will have no choice but to pull down the shutters and say, I'm sorry, I can't take anybody. I can't take anybody. I haven't got the staff. So I think they need to be brought into the mix. And part of what I think needs to happen, you know, we have a lot of SME care providers. A lot of my clients are SME care providers. And people need to find their voice. They need to find their platform. So somebody like Pete has a great platform, and people in power in government will listen to him. I think that the people in the government don't seem to understand what's going on. They don't have a sufficient grasp of the detail to do the planning, to roll out these policy decisions in a considered way. And they have all kinds of unintended consequences and knock-on effects that they haven't really thought through yet. So people who do understand the system, and that is operators small to large, need to find their platform. So what is that platform for the smaller provider? I think you've got your care associations, local care associations, national care associations. Those are the ways that you can make your voice heard. And these issues have to be explained and explained quite clearly. So I think that's probably the main thing, and discussing that in conjunction with your local NHS people as well, and getting them on side to explain what the knock-on effects are for the whole system. And, you know, we talk about it all the time, but is anybody listening? So you need to find the platform to be able to express that. And I'm sort of guessing Nathan might have a view on that as well.
You are, Nathan. Cue Nathan.
Thank you. Two quick pieces of information. The government's next recruitment campaign for the care sector launches in October, which was previously badged as Every Day is Different, but they've changed the branding. But that kicks off in October, running through to the end of the year, with a huge amount of obviously government-backed advertising for that, which I'm sure may help the sector. Obviously, it's for everyone, but worth tapping into or thinking about. And then this morning, to confirm, the government launched a consultation 6 weeks long on mandatory vaccine for frontline NHS staff and frontline social care staff in settings that weren't previously covered by the previous law, which I believe applies to supported living, would be the biggest area that's being consulted on for social care. So that's worth bearing in mind. In terms of what we've been talking about, for me, I think it's the one thing that we can do better as a sector is improve how we, as I would say this, of course, communicate with our families, with our colleagues. The government's pretty clear from the announcements this week that they see the salaries of care workers as being something both for the industry and, as far as they're concerned, it's the national living wage, which is effectively a legal minimum, is where they see care worker salaries being. So if we live in a world where we might not necessarily be able to compete with others on pay, we should be doing more to compete on recognition and soft reward for colleagues, and engaging with people, two-way dialogue with colleagues to understand their concerns and what we can do to help them. One of the things I'm often surprised about is how many providers I work with who rely on their home managers to do all of their communications with colleagues and families with some central steer, but there's no oversight of what exactly is said or is going out. And I think if we're talking about managers needing to have a much greater role in working on the floor and filling in staffing shortages, there's probably some operators who could support their managers by picking up some of the slack on communications, because actually if that bit falls down, you'll have a problem down the line, and your manager can't be everywhere at once. But I think that's an easy thing for central teams to be able to support with in the short term at least. And then on recruitment in general, I think it's about understanding why your current staff are with you and have worked with you for a long time, and how you can tell those messages and tell that story to the public, because actually care work is radically different to some of the other types of work those people might do in terms of hospitality. And I think there's a really positive message to tell about the benefits of working in care, working with vulnerable people, making a difference to those lives and the connections that you have, and they're not transient connections as well. I think all too often we focus a lot on trying to get as many people to apply as possible, and less about how can we convince people that this is a sector that's worth dedicating their time to, and might not be the best paid, but it is probably the most rewarding. in a soft way.
Nathan, I think there's some really good points there, and perhaps the strategic point also is to remember that although it's important for the sector to tell its story to residents and their families and to the political world, it's also hugely important to tell the story to the people who might consider working in the sector, and how it compares and what the advantages are of working in social care compared with other things that they might consider.
Yeah, there's a huge amount of misconception about what care work involves. It's something I've been doing with Leeds Council, as they have a project running around trying to change public's perception of what care work involves, but it's hugely outdated. And I think providers of all types have a lot of they can do to help shift and explain what care work is, so that more people see it as something they would like to do, and it's less of the old stereotypes from 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah. Yes. Well, social care isn't the only sector where that is a requirement, but it definitely is. I agree. So, Philip, finally, some concluding thoughts from yourself.
Yeah, I think a lot of it's already been said, but I think the healthcare world and the care sector in particular, the whole aspect of employee engagement and maybe looking at other ways of how to support their employees and look for different ways of helping that retention and that recruitment element are going to be really important. It all feeds into risk. Ultimately, it's a circle, whether it's operational risk or your workforce strategies. And I think one of the things that just I would leave it with, we, as you just said, it's not just the social care sector. And we've obviously worked with a range of sort of providers of all sorts of services, different sectors, where they're not necessarily all at the top end of the pay scale. And so maybe taking learnings from other sectors where, staff turnover and low pay are equal challenges, and looking at how they do it, as opposed to maybe looking inwards, look outwards and say, well, what are the learnings that we can take from other industries and other sectors?
Indeed. Well, that also is wise words, I think. Pete, you've unmuted yourself. Did you have a concluding thought?
Well, yeah, I think everyone's made good points. I think clearly this is not being made easy by the national insurance hike for employers' contributions as well as staff contributions. So that's personally from next April going to cost us £5 or £6 million on payroll, which is not funded by anybody. But yet the cap on social care payments for individuals doesn't kick in until 18 months later at the end of 2023. So why they're going to take a levy from us when it's not benefiting the people who are saving, being fixed in social care, is just, and again, an utter piece of madness and smoke and mirrors that just is funding the NHS and nothing to do with social care. And it's not helping us recruit more because we'd like to pay people more. We haven't been a living wage employer for some time now, and we're always looking to give better staff rewards and recognition, both money, bonuses, but also in softer ways. And I just don't think putting a tax on ourselves so we can restrict how much more we pay our staff is a clever way of actually helping us recruit in the sector. Well, when I say not a clever way, I meant something worse, but I won't say.
Following up the English habit of understatement. Okay. I think at that point, this session is due to finish in 2 minutes' time. So I'm going to say a huge thank you to our two partners for this session, Marsh and Royd Withy King, and the representatives on the panel, Philip Dearn and Mei-Ling. I'd also like to thank Nathan Hollow from PLMR for reminding us of the importance of managing our reputations in different contexts, and to Pete Calveley, who's been doing all these things for longer probably than you choose to remember, Pete. But thank you to one and all for your contributions this morning. I hope it's been interesting and thought-provoking session. Thank you for joining us this morning.